Good morning, everyone. I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's Office Manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Bridge the Digital Divide for Patients with Disabilities, Ensure Accessibility. And today's presenter, Stephanie Rollins. Dr. Stephanie Rollins is a research and writing specialist at the Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base. She is also an adjunct professor for the University of Alabama and teaches digital reference, collection development, and organization of information, among other courses. Stephanie serves on both regional and state library committees, and she has 23 years of experience in academic and special libraries. She holds a BA in English from Auburn University, a master's degree in library service, and a doctorate in public administration, both from the University of Alabama. Please welcome Stephanie Rollins and enjoy her webinar.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Can everybody hear me okay? Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Nobody's typing, so I'm like, I see Deb with the thumbs up. Thank you, Deb. So today I'm going to talk to you about something that I feel super passionate about. And in fact, before I went to library school, I volunteered at my state level National Library for the Blind and Physically Handicapped. And it's something I felt so passionate about, I thought that that would end up being my career in libraries. And it didn't work out that way because when you make a plan, of course, the universe laughs at you, and it's ended up even better than I could have ever imagined. But this is something that concerns me with a person who has a disability. It concerns me in terms of the future and technology and that gap between what people have and people don't have in terms of accessibility to electronic resources, to the library. So all of these things really concern me on a personal level as well as a professional level, and making sure that everybody has equal access to information and the things they need to be successful in life. So today we're going to talk about what things we can do to bridge that divide. Some of the things we're going to look at is, what is a disability? What does it look like for the United States? What does it look like for the state of Florida? Why should we focus on accessibility in libraries? And we all know this because this is something I think everybody's passionate about, and we're trying to make sure everybody has that equal access. What do we mean by electronic accessibility? I'm not necessarily talking about building structures and different things like that today. We're focusing more on the electronic. What accessibility standards and laws do you need to know for your library? And it can be really confusing depending on where you get your money from, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I work for a federal institution, and things are changing, especially with some of the court cases and some of the things that are out there. And what is the digital divide? What does that mean for people with disabilities? What does it mean for us in libraries? And then how can we improve this? I don't have all the answers. I have some ideas, and hopefully they're things that maybe you can take and run with in your library. Some of the things that you may have to do is you may have to make a case for accessibility, like a business case. And sometimes it's hard to equate libraries in a business environment because we don't necessarily make money, we make lives better, right? So it's kind of hard sometimes to make that case, that business case. Some of the things you can do is if you don't have a plan for electronic resources, it's not in your collection development and different things like that, you can implement a plan for accessibility. You can also, most important, is provide and create accessible content. If it's not accessible, people can't use your library. And there's some tools and some apps and resources that I want to point out to you. If we're aware of these and we know how they work, even if it's something as simple as how to use a PC with the screen magnifier, those are all things that can help make our libraries more accessible. And then throughout, I've got some homework opportunities for you. If there's things that you want to try, with a webinar, we can't be 100% interactive, but I've got some things if you want to go back as a team in your library and try. Please feel free. It's optional, but again, I think there are things that might help you in your library team. Just kind of be aware and think about things. So what is a disability? It's spelled out in the Social Security Administration, so if you went to apply for a disability, which I've done before, there are certain things that they classify as disability, and it's not everything that you would necessarily think of. I mean, there's people in the world who have hidden disabilities, right, that don't necessarily identify. I'm one of those people. I don't necessarily tell everybody that I have a disability, so mine's kind of hidden. But there are certain things that people can apply for disability for, and they're very specific. And so this is actually the part of the disability law from the Social Security Administration. And so there's a Part A and a Part B. And I'm not going to read this to you, but you can go back. I've got the website. It lists exactly what disabilities are, considered according to the law. And so Part A is for adults age 18 and over, and then Part B is for children who are under 18. And so if you look at it, it's clear, but it's kind of vague, I would say, at the same time, because federal laws define a person with a disability as any person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. So in general, it includes things like hearing, mobility, visual impairments, chronic alcoholism, mental illness, AIDS-related complex, and mental retardation that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So when they're talking about major life activities, they include things like walking, talking, hearing, seeing, breathing, learning, performing manual tasks, and taking care of yourself. So that just kind of gives you a picture of some of the disabilities that are out there. And then, like I said, you can't tell sometimes when somebody has a disability. So why should we focus on it in libraries? Well, we kind of have a guiding principle here, and this has not been updated since 2001. And I keep expecting our parent organization to update this, but they haven't yet, unless I totally missed it and I scoured the internet before this presentation to make sure. But there's a policy out there, and you guys have seen this before, correct? You can just type in the chat box if I ask questions, and I'll check back in with you. But this is the policy for services for people with disabilities, and it came out in 2001. And at least me, as librarians, feel like that people with disabilities are kind of a large and neglected minority, right? And so they have sometimes faced economic inequity, literacy issues. They're culturally isolated. Sometimes they face discrimination in education, employment, and just kind of life activities. Not everybody, but a lot of people. If you look at the statistics, this is borne out. So we can play a dramatic role in people's lives by helping them participate fully in society, even if they don't set foot into our library. We can do that with our electronic resources and some of our programming that we do online and different things like that. So we want to make sure that we implement principles of universal design, and I'll talk about universal design versus accessibility a little bit later. And so for the purposes of this policy, must means mandated by law or within ALA's control, and should means it's strongly recommended or you should make an effort to. So some of this information about that, again, I'm not going to read it to you. All this is going to be here for you if you'd like to go back and read it. These slides are a little bit note heavy, but as we get further on, less notes, more talking. So the scope of the law brings in some of the laws such as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the ADA, the ADA 1, Title 1 and 2, and Title 3, and also sometimes 508 depending on if you have a federal library. Those are some of the laws that are important to disability, and I'll talk a little bit more detail about that in a little bit. So we obviously shouldn't discriminate against individuals with disabilities, and they should have equal access to library resources. And that could mean, waiving late fines, things that would help them to, be able to use the library a little bit better. Things like Deb having an American Sign Language interpreter with real-time captioning. How fabulous is that? At library programs, right? So this should also consider when you're planning collections or programming, you should also think about including people with disabilities as participants. Also if you can hire people with disabilities, there's a real underrepresentation in our field of people with disabilities. And as far as your facilities, who hasn't had an issue with trying to make your facilities more accessible. Also collections, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is making your collections accessible to people with disabilities. Different formats, they should be modified to be reasonably accessible, and as long as it doesn't functionally alter library services. Also, we should plan to have assistive technology. You know, in today's world, there's so much more we could do than in the past, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of evolution of assistive technology and what was around when I started and what we have today, and how we, if we're aware of those, we can share them with parents or caretakers or people with disabilities, and it can help them, you know, kind of mediate their disability so they can have access to all these wonderful things that libraries provide. And so we need to be aware of that technology and know how to use it. Finally, employment, library education, ALA conferences, ALA publications. Those should all think about, you know, hiring people with disabilities. In, you know, master's programs, there should be adequate resources for people with disabilities who are attending library school. At conferences and the publications that the American Library Association provides, there should be an accessible method for those. Okay, so if you're like me, I like to look at the numbers. And so if you think about the population of the United States, and this is from the American Community Survey, and when I talk about collections and services and programming and different things like that, I always like to look at who's in my community and what types of people, and you know, it's not a complete answer, but it gives you a little bit of background, a little bit of information of who is in your community. So looking at the big picture of the United States, in 2017, there's 12.7% people with a disability, and those are people who identify as having a disability. Not everybody identifies, right? 12.7%, and it breaks down the ages, and if you look, the biggest population, 48.7%, is for people over 75. And as a country, we're getting older and older. There's not as, I believe, not as many people being born, and correct me if I'm wrong. So we're having a, you know, kind of this aging population. In fact, I'm getting there myself. So, you know, we're having people getting older and older, and they're going to have disabilities, and they're going to use our libraries. People like me are going to use your library. And so if you look at the 6 different types of disabilities in the U.S., the highest one here is the ambulatory disability. So people who are having trouble navigating, you know, they can't walk or they can't use their hands or different things like that. And the next most popular one is the independent living disability. So people who can't, you know, take care of themselves independently by themselves. So if you look at the numbers, this is more about the numbers, and it's kind of the same slide, but sometimes people like to see the numbers. So you can see that the number of people with any disability in the United States is that 40 million? 40,714,800. And again, this is not everybody in the United States. This is just the census and the American Community Study trying to quantify what it looks like in the United States. And then more important for you, looking at Florida, we actually have the higher, you guys actually have higher than the national average with 13.6% for people of all ages. And again, it's that same age group of 75 plus that's the highest, 65 to 74 next lowest. And tell me if you've, you know, just type in the chat box if you have a second, that you see this in your libraries, that these statistics are supported or not. And so in Florida, again, the highest is the ambulatory disability. It's actually a little bit higher than the national average. And in terms of Florida, you can see kind of some of the numbers here. So, you know, over 2 million people have a disability in Florida. And again, you can see the kind of the breakdown and the numbers of people who have disabilities and what that picture kind of looks like. So, you know, it's important to focus on it because these are the numbers. These are the people that are in your state that are using our libraries. So the other issue is caregivers, parents, people with disabilities. They need to know about their disability. They need to know what it entails. They need to know what kind of services are out there. And so this is according to a Pew study, and 80% of internet users have looked online for information about health topics, you know, disabilities and different things like that. So that translates to over 59% of all adults in this survey that they did. So people are online, people are looking for information on their health, on their disability. And so we need to be able to answer their questions, and we need to know the sources, we need to be able to point them to services and different things like that. And so this is just a little bit more information about that service, but you know, 25% have looked at an online video about health or medical issues. You know, looked at drugs and treatment and doctors and different things like that. So people are out there and they're looking. So if they come to our library, we need to be aware of those resources. And I'll cover very quickly later some of the sources that you can look at and go back to after this presentation. So providing accessible library services, again, like I said in the beginning, think about knowing your community. Who are your information consumers in terms of people with disabilities? And do you have services, do you have subject matter resources that are going to help them? And we do, and like I said, I'll show you some of those. People are asking questions about disabilities and resources and technology and services. You need to evaluate what you've got. And then also, how can you communicate this and provide instruction and possibly training for your staff? And also, this speaks to things about health literacy. Do you have those informations? Is your staff trained on how to not handle is not the right word, but enhance the library experience of people with disabilities? And a lot of people just don't have that training, and it's not that they're trying to not help people, it's just they don't know what to do. And so I think it's very important to have that training. And then sometimes people, when they ask questions about disabilities, it can get kind of into a legal area. We need to be careful about providing health information, and we all know that, but just keep that in mind. And if you're trying to find a picture of the disabled people with disabilities in your community, this American Fact Finder can kind of give you a picture, just like I did earlier. And there's some other statistical resources that I can show you a little bit later. Okay, so what does electronic accessibility mean? So this is kind of the accessibility 101 part, and some of this may be total review for you. But when we're talking about accessibility in this webinar, we're talking more about electronic accessibility, so the web, ebooks, journals, different things like that. And so when you're thinking about accessibility on the web, you're thinking about inclusion. And so what you're talking about is with web accessibility, it means people can use the web. And it means that all people with disabilities can use the web, whether they have visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, or neurological disorders. So it's providing kind of this environment of inclusion where they can use it. And it also focuses on equal access, equal opportunity, and it overlaps with other best practices like the WCAG 2.1 and 2.0, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But basically what they talk about is that your web accessibility, when you have things on the web and you provide electronic resources, your material should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And if any of these aren't true, then people aren't able to use the web. And I'll explain more about what that is. I'm sure this is a little bit hard for you to read. But yeah, so that's kind of what we're talking about, is just making sure people are included and are able to use the web. So in terms of the library, what do we produce electronically? What are things that we do that help people? So of course, probably one of the biggest is the library homepage. We produce, research guides or LibGuides. A lot of libraries do that. We have handouts and tutorials and videos. We provide access to databases, ebooks, e-journals, and also we provide computer access, right? People will come in and use our library for computer access. What else do we do that's electronic? If you just type in the chat box, if there's anything else I've missed, which I'm sure I have, but those are some of the big things that we do electronically, right? Okay, so this is the guy who invented the web. It's a picture of him. And he says the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. And so the web opened things up tremendously for people with disabilities. However, if you don't provide access, based on the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative standards, and these are them, and I'm just going to explain them to you real quickly and kind of give you some examples. Yeah, chat, thank you. I got that on a later slide, Rob. Absolutely, and I think that is amazing for people that can't come to your library for some reason. They can still get access to a skilled reference librarian or library technician. I think that's fantastic. So perceivable. And so perceivable means the information and user interface have to be presentable in ways that users can perceive. So they have to be able to see the information being, not see, but they have to be able to perceive the information being presented. It can't be invisible to all of their senses. So for instance, if you have an online training video, it needs to be captioned, right? Or it needs to, maybe have live captioning. Or your forms need to have fields so people know what the field says, different things like that. It needs to be operable. And so, the user interface and navigation, you have to be able to operate it. So they have to, have a menu or something, or they need to be able to tab keys so they can operate the interface. And things like that are, if you have something where you have to do control and shift, and somebody can't use the keyboard, say they're using a switch device where their eyes use an Apple camera to use the on-screen keyboard, it's sometimes going to be difficult for them to be able to use those two keys at once. So, or a menu that has submenus that you have to use the mouse to do the drop down. Those are things to think about that makes it inoperable for people with disabilities. It needs to be understandable, so the information and the interface needs to be able to understand the information as well as the operation of the interface. So it can't be beyond people's understandings. So, like, if you have different menus on every single web page on your web page, that's going to be hard for people with disabilities. You need to have and this is just good web design, period, not just for people with disabilities. If you have your menu in the same place, you're not going to confuse your user, and it makes it more operable. Also, it needs to be robust. So as technology changes, the content or operation can't be beyond their understanding. So for instance, you have to use this specific version of a web browser for this site to work. That's not robust. And it also has to be able, the content has to be, if it's updated, still has to work with assistive technology. So these are some pretty high level accessibility initiatives. This isn't law. This is just what, to use the web, people with disabilities need to be able to have in order to access your site. So I've got some examples, and of course these are kind of extreme, and you can check on them later, but this first one, the second one, Yvette's Bridal Shop, this is just like an eighth of the page, and it's kind of a crazy website. I don't know how anybody with a disability, even me who can see, would have trouble with that. So think about things when you design your websites, and I know that we all do. So there's a lot of talk about accessibility versus universal design, and what's the difference and why is that important? So accessibility focuses on the needs of people with disabilities, right? And that's pretty specific. Universal design is quite a bit broader, and it considers all people. It's usable to all people for the greatest extents possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So if you think about automatic doors that open when you get close, that benefits everybody. That's universal design. It also helps people with disabilities, but it also helps if you have a stroller and you have a kid, right? Or curb cutouts, those benefit everybody. And like this picture, this wasn't adapted afterwards for people with disability. It's got a ramp that goes all the way up the steps, and it was just kind of built in automatically. That's universal design. And so, focusing on universal design is going to benefit everybody. And also, accessibility shouldn't just be a design principle. It shouldn't just be an added feature. It should be built into what we're doing. So just a real quick review, we do talk a little bit about assistive technology, and I just wanted to define that for you. Just really quickly, there's some that's no-tech, right? Things like magnifying glasses or Braille. I would say Braille is high-tech for me. I haven't been able to learn it. There's low-tech. You can tape your classes. There's all kinds of apps out there that you can now tape your class, upload it to YouTube. It'll do a transcript. There's video descriptions on things like Netflix. And then there's high-tech. There's things where it will read the screen to you. They have speech recognition software. We've got things built into our computers. So there's all kinds of assistive technology out there that's fantastic that can help people. And I really like this quote. We can reframe accessibility in terms of what we provide, so what libraries provide, not what other people lack. so we can really help people and think about reframing accessibilities in terms of what we can do for people. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit on some of the laws. There are some accessibility standards and laws out there that apply to us. There is Section 508, and this is, if you have any doubt about any of these laws, please talk to a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, so I'll throw that out there, but I do know quite a bit about it, and some of it directly applies to me because I do work for a federal agency, especially this one. This is Section 508, and they just updated it in terms of computer access, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. So if you are a federal library or you receive federal money, these are things that you need to think about in terms of your electronic accessibility. So basically, the 508 says that the public must have equivalent access to information regardless of ability. And this section 1194.22 specifically talks about web-based internet and internet information applications. So this is going to be hard for you to read, but you can come back and look at it. This is just Section 508. This is the law for my organization and our website. So this was just updated in 2018. And what this means now is that we have to abide by all 16 of this list here. So things like, alternative text, which we had before with 508. That's not really an update. But things like, giving people enough time to read. It's navigable. It prevents seizures. Color blindness, image maps, data tables. So those are all things that the law that my agency and any federal agency needs to abide by. And I would be interested to find a statistic that talks about how many actually do, because I know for a fact that a lot of federal libraries have not implemented these yet. And so one of the things I would talk to you about that's really important for people with disabilities using your electronic resources is this WCAG 2.0, and then they just updated it last year to include 2.1, which focuses on mobile devices. That's what the 2.1 does. And one of the things I would tell you is that this is not a law. These are guidelines, and I believe that they're going to become, they actually have become part of the 508. They are actually part of the law. If you look at some of these levels, the A and the double A, the 508 that I just showed you that long list of, those are actually part of the 508 law for us, for federal institutions. However, not every library is a federal institution, right? It's not part of that. However, when you look at some of the court cases and different things, the judges are ranking websites in court cases against this double A level. And so I put the website there for you. There's pages and pages of what the different standards are. Basically, A is low, double A is mid-range, and triple A is really hard. Triple A is almost like a text-only website, so it's a little bit more difficult to get to, and I don't know hardly any sites out there that are triple A. So just to give you an example of an A, so an A level would be something that's pre-recorded and has a caption. A double A would be that the live videos have captioning, kind of like what Deb's doing. And then triple A would be the sign language that's already pre-recorded with the video. And like I said, judges in court cases are finding level AA as the appropriate standard. And then the ADA was looking and would have gone to effect in January 2018, that they would have held federal websites to the double A level. Now the 508 implemented that, but not the ADA. And so I just feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this double A level is going to be coming for most websites in the world, and in fact Europe already is in alignment with that. So the 2.0 and 2.1 put out this success criteria for all of these different levels. And the new one, the 2.1, is not part of the law. That's brand new. And it provides 17 success criteria as guidance for mobile device users. Things like if you have to mount your cell phone sideways, landscape, on your wheelchair, that the website should still display appropriately, things like that. So these are new things to kind of help with the mobile aspect of devices and settings and different things like that. So they're guidelines, right? Like they say in Pirates of the Caribbean, they're guidelines. But I just feel like they're a sign of what's to come. And so we need to be aware of them. We need to be putting them on our websites. And the other thing is, it's for accessibility, right? But it's also just good web design. So when you're thinking about making these changes, if your site has some issues, and I'll show you how you can test your site a little bit later, these are things you need to think about. Go ahead and do it. Make your site at that AA level, and it's only going to enhance the experience of everybody who uses your website. So that was just kind of a 101 overview, and this is more kind of accessibility 102, why it matters. And we all know why it matters. I've already talked about this. The equal access to information for jobs, for finding out about the world, for satisfying your curiosity about things, right? Equal opportunity. It gives people academic freedom. They can find that information to make decisions about things in their lives and things that they're studying at school. And let's face it, in today's world, technology has become the library's academic medium. This is how we communicate with a lot of people, even if they don't, they don't come into our library physically. And also, it's important. We need to meet these aspects of the law and the policies that the federal government and the state government and the local government sets out. Because yes, PowerPoint will be available, Rob. So these are things we need to think about in terms of not just doing the right thing, but enhancing people's experiences with libraries in their lives. These are things that we want to think about. So there have been some library court cases. There's a lot more out there. Berkeley had a case in 2013 with print disabilities. University of Montana, people couldn't get to their completely inaccessible technology. Penn State, so a lot of the big universities out there. And then one of the things, in terms of new technology, we get all excited about new technology, right? The Sacramento Public Library purchased these Nooks for everybody to use, didn't kind of do any pre-testing, and the Nook e-readers were completely inaccessible. So think about, the new technology. You want to test it, right? Get people involved who have disabilities to test it for you. There are some public court cases. This one was brand new. This was, it's a couple years old, but it is one of the first court cases where a public organization was sued, and the court case was won because this guy wanted to go online and get coupons and things just like anybody else would, and it was completely inaccessible for him. And looking at the case, if you look at it, the judge kind of decided in favor of the plaintiff because of things like the AA standards that we talked about just a minute ago. So, I mean, things that happen, you can get sued. Target got sued. Sydney Olympic Games, American Express redesigned their website, and visually impaired people could no longer bank. So just people make changes in technology without thinking and without doing testing, and then people can't access their site. They can't do normal everyday things. So those are some cases you can look at. And later on we talk about making your case. These are things that you may want to refer back to. So a little bit more about the law. This definitely applies to most libraries, even if you're not a federal agency. This is 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So nobody should be excluded from, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. So most of our libraries receive federal financial assistance, either through a grant or different things like that. So even if you're not part of the Section 508, you may fall under Section 504. So again, it's the right thing to do, but the law also reinforces that, right? So again, it's 508. And here's some websites that tell you kind of about the changes and the roadmap to the new kind of 508. And this is electronic and information technology. And not just the web, but it's also software, it's also documents. So it has a couple of different functions. It was just passed in January of 2017. It focuses on functionality. Instead of looking at product type, you're looking at advances in technology. So not dependent on technology, but what's happening in technology. It looks at, again, that industry alignment with the WCAG 2.0 websites and also e-documents and software. And it wants to ensure that all content is accessible. So that list of 16 things that I showed you, those are things that are supposed to make all content accessible. And so it's a lot of changes. I think people with, that fall under the federal government are going to have to scramble to make those changes. And again, if you look at it with foresight and do some of the major things that are on that list, it's not super complicated. And I'm going to show you some tools where you can test your site. So another one is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Again, there's a couple of titles from that apply to libraries. Again, protecting individuals with disabilities against discrimination in services, programs, and activities provided by state and local government. Also, Title III of the ADA. Again, it prohibits access in private colleges and universities and requires reasonable accommodations for allowing full participation in programs. So college libraries as well fall under this. And then if you've had a chance to look at this before, this is from 2012. The Association of Research Libraries did this joint task force in kind of a college library setting. And it talks about kind of requiring publishers. We deal so much with publishers and pay them a lot of money for our resources. It just talks about kind of the best practices to comply with legal requirements for accessibility, and including the language in publisher and vendor contracts if you deal with that. And also it talks about requesting VPATs, and I'll talk about what that is in just a second. Just real quick in the chat box, I feel like I've been talking for a long time, and I just have a couple questions for you. What does accessibility look like at your library? Do you have it in writing? What's your responsibility? What's your role in terms of being a librarian or library staff or faculty or a student worker, or just what does it look like at your library? And just it doesn't have to be a long sentence, but just kind of what does it look like at your library? And if you don't know, again, this is a chance for you to think about that and be aware and go look at that, right? So things to think about. And I'm gonna keep going, but I'm gonna check the chat box and I'll comment on that in just a second. So the title of the presentation is talking about digital divide, but I wanted to kind of preface that with a lot of information for you to understand why it's so important and what is the picture of disability and what does the law look like. And so when we talk about the digital divide, and you guys have probably already figured out what this is, but this refers to the gap between populations that have access to modern information and communication and those that don't, or they have restrictions, or they don't have any at all. And this can be computers, it can be TVs, it can be the internet, it can be mobile devices. It's a ton of different things. And people are typing about their libraries. I'm really excited. So this is not a really fantastic graphic, but it's an interesting graphic because it shows kind of that gap. So 54% of households with a disability use the internet in the United States, compared to 81% of households without a disability use the internet in the United States. So you can see that gap there, right? That's definitely a digital divide. And then another thing is that 74% of people with disabilities in the United States have a cell phone, and 54% of them use the internet. A total of people with disabilities, we already talked about that, and then 47% have a desktop PC. So think about that. 74% of people with disabilities in the United States have a cell phone, and they are using us libraries mobile, right? So again, when you think about these different guidelines and making your site accessible, don't forget about the mobile. But there's definitely kind of that digital divide between people who use the internet with no disability and people who have a disability. And the other thing too is that there was a Pew study in 2010, and what they found is that 2% of American adults with disabilities have a real challenge using the internet, and they're less likely to use it than other adults. That's huge. The other thing is those who have access to the internet usually don't have wireless, they usually don't have broadband, and so it's a lot harder for people looking for jobs and people looking for health information to have that high-speed access to information. So those are other things to think about in terms of this digital divide. So what can we do to help? And I'm going to talk through some of those things. And Mary, I'm looking at your comment here. She says they're starting to address this more, put our digitized collection online, so we need to have make the images, PDFs, and sound recordings meet the accessibility requirements. Okay, and so I'm going to go through, if you have PDFs, I'm getting ahead of myself, but our organization, we do books, documents, papers in PDF. And so there's some ways that you can do that will help you check your PDF that are fantastic. And I'll get to that. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I think it might be helpful for you. So one of the things you may need to do, hopefully this isn't the case for most of us, but you may need to make kind of a business case for accessibility. You might need to provide case studies and statistics. For instance, CNET redid their site, and they provided transcripts, live transcripts of their videos, and they saw a 50% increase in visits to their site. So, you may have to, libraries are hard to put in terms of businesses, but you may have to make the case for accessibility and use some case studies and statistics. I just gave you a bunch of statistics in the beginning. The other thing is make a list of the benefits that come with accessibility. Better access to information. Libraries, this is a no-brainer for us, for libraries, to make a quick summary of the benefits. It also, like I've talked about a little bit, when you improve your site for accessibility, you're improving it for things like search engine optimization, which means that the search engines are going to look at your site and be able to find it quicker, however they index it. Because you have alternate text and things that don't show up, it just increases the visibility of your site. Your semantics, your functionality, your content structure, it's going to get your site, and it's going to be more relevant to your users. The other thing is you may have to do a return on investment, which is really hard for libraries because we don't typically make a ton of money, right? So one of the things you have to think about is how can you show a return on investment. There's an article out there on Goodwill, and when they redid their site for accessibility, they saw a market increase of 8%. Now, it's hard for us to see a market increase, but we might be able to see more users on our site, that kind of thing, after we look at things for accessibility. So there's a little calculator here. This is an ROI calculator. I wasn't super successful with it, but I don't know what I'm looking at, and I'm not a business person. So if you have somebody in your library or somebody who can do business stuff, this is a free calculator that will help you figure out your return on investment on a website. And so that may be something that would interest you. Again, you're trying to build this case, you're trying to show why accessibility is important, which we all know, but in some cases, you don't have staff, you don't have the funding. How can you make this case for accessibility for your website or your products that you provide? And then also, you could get sued, which libraries have been sued, right? Because you don't have accessible websites. So I've given you some examples of those. If you get that far, or if your library is pretty decent with accessibility, but you're not quite there yet, like Mary's thinking about how can they make their digitized collections online more accessible, you may need to plan and implement an accessible e-resource policy. So these are some of the things that are included in that. And they're pretty basic. We've seen this before in terms of planning kind of any project in a library. But you'll need to do a needs assessment, possibly a self-assessment. You'll need to get buy-in. You'll actually need to implement the plan. And then you have to figure out how to make it sustainable. So this is kind of each of these steps. So who are your constituents? And if you're thinking in terms of people with disabilities, what does that picture look like? What resources do we have? what people do we have? Are there any current accessibility efforts underway? Have you tested your website? Have you tested your PDF documents? Have you run it through an accessibility checker? Do you have policies in place? Is it part of your written collection policy? Do you know if your databases are accessible? Again, you want to identify key players, whether it's library, school, community, partners, different things like that. And then again, you want to draft your argument. This is kind of the same thing as making your case for accessibility or for making this part of your accessibility plan possible. Then you want to set up a task force. Involve people who are interested in this, involve administration, maybe those partners, community partners, whoever it is that's going to be the best advocate for this process. You want to set up standards, goals, and timelines. What do you want to accomplish, and how frequently should you update this plan? And then training. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Who needs training, and how will it be provided, and how will you control the quality? And then finally, how are you going to sustain this? If somebody leaves, if Mary, who's doing all this great work with PDF, leaves, who's going to take over that? So put policies in place, put it in people's job descriptions. Have a training plan that you can transfer, different things like that, so it's sustainable. So some homework for you, if you choose to accept it, is to answer some of these questions and look at that implementation plan. And then ask yourself, who benefits from accessible design? People who have visual issues or auditory or cognitive learning, physical issues, speech. But really, I have this in bright, big, red capital letters screaming at you, I'm sorry. But really, everybody benefits from accessible design, right? Everybody. So another way we can, besides making the case for accessibility and also having a plan and implementing it, is outright providing accessible resources, e-resources, that can bridge that digital divide, because people accessing you can have access to that. So one of the things you really need to think about is your library's collection development policy. Do you know, just off the top of your head, you type yes or no, and if you type no, it's okay. You can look after the presentation. Does it reference accessibility? Does it mention web or web accessible resources at all? And that's important. That's important to have in your collection development policy. And then if you don't, ask yourself what you can do locally. What can you do on your level to make sure this happens? It may require engaging library leadership, right? Because you can't really redraft the collection development policy on your own. So have that conversation. Have that conversation. But think about your collection development policy, and you may need to modify it. And I've got a couple of examples here for you. One is a college library, and one is a public library. But it just kind of gives you, it doesn't have to be, 5, 10 pages. It can be one or half a page, right? So do you guys know if your collection development policy has accessibility or people with disabilities in it? I didn't ever see anybody type, so I'm just curious. You don't know, okay? So, and there's nothing wrong with that. So you'll go check, right? So it's important. It really is important. And then this is one that's more like a public library. And so it talks about books, and this is actually from, I think, ACLD. I forget where that is off the top of my head. But you can see what's there, and it's important. So, it may just be a paragraph in your collection development policy. But, people with disabilities, materials, that definitely needs to be part of it. The other thing is you want your vendors on board, the people that, we pay tons of money to get our databases. And this is just, the really big vendors do it right most of the time, like EBSCO and ProQuest and Taylor and Francis. So these are some of the vendor documentation that they have about disability. So you can check your databases to see. Right, absolutely, audio for the journals. That's great, Reva. And so we have to let our vendors know that accessibility is important, because we don't always subscribe to those big name database vendors, right? So we want to make sure that the PDFs are accessible. They have some sort of audio component, like Reva said. Our web interfaces have properly leveled page elements. We have multimedia resources with closed captioning, and then request a VPAT. And a VPAT is simply, this is some information about how you can approach vendors with licensing. So a VPAT is just simply a form for vendors to use that specifies how you want them to work with accessibility. It requires sometimes a high level of expertise, but this is just kind of what it looks like. And so for your homework, go and look at one, because if you deal with database contracts, this is something that's really important to make sure everybody has access. Okay, so very quickly, creating accessible content. Again, the same things that we produce: the library homepage, the research guides, the databases, ebooks, and journals. We want to make sure that our people, everybody, can get to our website and use them appropriately. Questions to ask yourself: can people get what they need on your website? Do you have good color contrast? Do you have keyboard-only navigation set up because some people can't use a mouse? Remember, I talked a little bit about that. Do you have alt text for images? Easy to read plain language without jargon? Clearly defined headings? Do you have captions and transcripts for videos? And you want to minimize all that flashing different things. And then also in our content management systems, there's some links here for you to look at. In Blackboard, in WordPress, and in our LibGuides, there's some recommendations here about how to make sure that you don't push out people that can't access your site. And virtual reference. Again, this helps eliminate some of the intimidation factor when you have to physically ask for help. So that's a great resource. I'm real excited about that. Again, a lot of our e-journals and books and different things have built-in accessibility. For instance, Kindle does, Overdrive does, so that opens up the world to people with disabilities. There's also an app for the National Library Service, if you qualify, called BARD, and that's another way to get Braille or audiobooks. So you may want to looking at what your site looks like for somebody who's blind, and so this is just an activity for you to do that. But very simple. You want to provide alt text images so that it describes exactly what's there. So this is a really good example. These are just some simple things. You want to make sure that your links say what they are, not click here, right? And multimedia, here's a horrible example of captioning, right? And it's gotten so much better, but it's not quite there yet. So in terms of captioning, in terms of adjustable size and contrast, this is horrible to read, right? On the left, you can't read it. The other thing is, make sure your navigation's accessible. Don't have repetitive, things that take you to the same place on the same page. Make sure your headings are logical, and that your content is logical too. And so this is a lot of information, especially with forms. You need to have labels. You're filling something out and you can't see the form. It's going to be hard to fill out, and also extend the time if it's a timed form. So how can you check for all these things? And if you don't know exactly every single thing that's on the WCAG 2.0 and 2.1, these are some sites you can go to that will actually test your website. You can either do it through a checklist. It's a program that will run. I'm giving you actually a couple of different ones, and you can run your website through it. There's some free tools out there, so I'm giving you some links to those. There's a Chrome extension that's a screen reader that will drive you absolutely crazy. There's actually some better ones out there that aren't too expensive, but if you just want to simulate, you can do that, or you can do VoiceOver on Apple. You can check tabbing. So some people can only use tabs to get from link to link on your page. So if you hit the tab key, you can see what order a screen reader or somebody with a switch could see how your website works. Again, there's a tool called Cynthia Says. It does WCAG 2.0 and Section 508 accessibility scans. Also, there's a before and after tool that takes a website and shows you before accessibility and after. It's kind of a neat site. So for your homework, I would take one of these tools and run it through the checker. Again, this is just kind of a repeat, but when you're making accessible documents in multimedia, think about the structure of the document, alternative text. You want to use tables widely, and you want to export to accessible PDFs and check accessibility features. So I'm going to run through this real quickly. But in Word, you can check for accessibility. You just click on File, Options, check Accessibility, and it'll tell you everything that is inaccessible in your document. And then once you do that, if you want to make it into a PDF, after you've checked everything, you can, again, click on Save as PDF, Options, and then you can actually click here where it says, Multimedia for Accessibility. And it will help you make those functions that make the PDF a little bit more accessible. Now, if you have the full PDF, what you can do is you can actually run it through the accessibility checker, and it will take everything that you've got here. It will attach an accessibility report, which is now what we're required to do for the federal government, and it'll run through a full check and check for things like alt text, whether or not there's a logical reading order for people with disabilities, different things like that. So it's fantastic. So again, homework throughout here, take some of these tools and run through them. Again, multimedia captions, it's a problem in libraries. Again, you can look at local options like our fabulous Deb here. But again, Camtasia, YouTube, volunteers, you can look at different apps for captioning. So really quickly, because we're running out of time, but I just want to talk to you really quickly. When I first started looking at a visual disability, this guy in the top left is what I had access to, and now we've got all these millions of apps and things for assistive technology. So the future is really bright in terms of making our libraries accessible, making our lives accessible. But in the beginning, we had Braille books and recorded books, and these, and the teletype phone, and this is what things looked like. And then, we kind of had computers come on board, and in terms of bridging that divide, I would make sure that you know how to access a Mac and a PC and all of these assistive technology things, because we have computers in our libraries, and this is something simple we can learn and show to people with disabilities so they can use our libraries. It's already built in. You don't even have to buy anything. It's already on the computer. So the PC and also the Mac have these built-in features. And just make yourself aware of them. And also your smartphone and tablet. Those came along and really opened up the world. Apple has a ton of built-in resources. You can use a switch to operate your cell phone, or combine it with a computer. There's no more large cumbersome equipment. And also Android has some built-in features. I think Apple is far and above one of the most accessible devices, but Android's definitely getting there. And then what I wanted to show you, and we're going to run out of time, but everything's here for you to look at later. There's some apps that simulate kind of what it's like to have a disability. So if you lost your vision or your hearing or you're colorblind, there's some simulators here, and these apps are free. And also if you have trouble identifying color, this color ID is fantastic. There's some apps for kids in terms of learning disability, some apps for people who have autism and can't talk. There's an American Sign Language Dictionary. There are resources out there and apps, for instance, like this P3 Mobile, where you can have somebody sign and it will actually text you what the person is saying. So somebody can appear independent and talk to you and text with you and have that independence, but still, not be restricted from participating in things. So there are 300,000 apps out there for people with disabilities. Another one I like, again, is this Auto Verbal Pro, and it's a little bit expensive, but it has like a million icons for people who have autism or have speech issues. And so, thinking about in terms of a library, if you have these apps on an iPad or even on your own personal phone, if you're on the reference desk and you're trying to help somebody, it just opens up the world to them. And then there's just a couple more apps here if you want to look through them. One of the things I did want to tell you about that I was really surprised about was that the Netflix has a voiceover on some of their movies. So that's something to really think about. And then we're out of time, but I would say, look at some of these homework activities. There's websites for collections of apps that you can look at. And then this is just a bonus here. What I would say is bridging the digital divide also means making sure that you can answer people's questions about disabilities. And so there are things with the Florida Electronic Library. There's some pay databases that are fantastic. There's a ton of free general websites out there, articles, statistics, and directories. So this is all laid out here for you to look at later. I wasn't going to go in depth into all of these anyways, but these are all here for you, and I've given you a description and given you a screenshot of what it looks like if you were to go to that site and try to use it. But I would say a lot of the questions, in terms of bridging that digital divide, in terms of answering questions for people with disabilities, it's hard because it's a very multidisciplinary type question sometimes. Sometimes you're going to medicine, sometimes you're going to education, sometimes you're going to technology. So being aware of these resources and being able to answer people's questions is very important. So I'm just going to go through very quickly and go to my end slide to see if I can help you. Let's see if I can get to the end slide to wrap it up. And like I said, throughout this, there's tons of homework. Let's see if I can get to the end here. I'm so sorry. There are a lot of slides here for you guys to look at later, and some examples. So don't get dizzy here. And what I would say is that together, we can make the case for accessibility as a team of librarians and administrators and faculty. We can, bridge that divide by making the case, by knowing our resources and knowing what apps are out there. And so we can create pressure on publishers, on people in administration, and it's just about thinking about things, being conscientious, and it's about accessible resources, not just for people with disabilities, but for everybody, because that provides better services for everyone. And so it's doing what's right, but it's also doing what's right for everybody. So thank you guys very much. And this is a list of all the homework. You can make yourself a checklist. But as you see, I've got a little line through the guy with do all the homework because it is optional. However, if you do a couple of these things, I don't think it's only going to bring awareness to you and your library team. So thank you guys very much. Again, please, you're going to get the handout for this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to email me directly. Like I said, this is a passion of mine. I'm always going to give you too much information on it because it's something I'm excited about and passionate about. And I think it's just the right thing to do for everybody in terms of providing access to resources and the wonderful things that we do for people that they sometimes aren't able to access. And so I'm very passionate about it. And if you have any questions or you just want to connect offline with me, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you so much. And I think we're out of time for questions too. I'm so sorry.
Thank you, Stephanie, for an informative webinar. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, we ask that you join us on June 7th for Stephanie's next webinar, Zero Budget Programming. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Deb.